the Karen Silkwood plutonium conspiracy trial. In 1974, nuclear worker Karen Silkwood filed a lawsuit against Kerr-McGee Corporation, documenting systematic falsification of safety records, deliberate plutonium contamination of workers, and corporate knowledge of radiation exposure levels that exceeded federal safety limits by hundreds of times at the Cimarron fuel fabrication site in Oklahoma. The case contained documentary evidence of nuclear safety violations, internal corporate memoranda acknowledging illegal manufacturing practices, and scientific testimony, demonstrating that quality control records for plutonium fuel rods destined for nuclear reactors had been systematically falsified to conceal dangerous defects that could cause reactor failures. Silkwood's role as chemical technician and union activist enabled her to compile photographic evidence of falsified X-rays, quality control documents showing deliberately altered test results, and internal communications, proving corporate management knew that defective fuel rods were being shipped to nuclear facilities while safety inspections were fabricated to satisfy Atomic Energy Commission requirements. The evidence Silkwood assembled included corporate documents showing that contamination incidents at the facility occurred with systematic frequency, that workers were exposed to plutonium levels exceeding occupational safety standards, and that company officials coordinated to suppress incident reports that would trigger federal safety investigations. Her personal apartment was found contaminated with plutonium at levels that required professional decontamination, with contamination patterns that suggested deliberate placement rather than accidental workplace exposure, while corporate security logs documented unusual access to her residence during periods when the contamination occurred. Medical testing revealed plutonium contamination in Silkwood's body at concentrations that indicated multiple exposure incidents, with isotopic signatures matching the specific plutonium processed at the Kerr-McGee facility, proving that her contamination originated from the workplace despite corporate claims that she had contaminated herself to create false evidence against the company. Most extraordinary are the circumstances of Silkwood's death on November 13, 1974, when her vehicle crashed on a remote Oklahoma highway while she was traveling to meet New York Times reporter David Burnham with documents proving the falsification of quality control records. The crash scene investigation revealed evidence of rear-end impact to her vehicle, suggesting she had been forced off the road, while the documents she had confirmed she was carrying were never recovered from the accident site. Oklahoma Highway Patrol investigators found inconsistencies in the crash evidence, including damage patterns that contradicted single-vehicle accident scenarios, but declined to pursue vehicular homicide investigation despite witness reports of another vehicle following Silkwood shortly before the crash. The missing documents included original quality control negatives, corporate memoranda detailing falsification procedures, and photographic evidence of defective fuel rod welds that Silkwood had described to union representatives and journalists in the hours before her death. Corporate internal communications revealed during lawsuit discovery showed that Kerr-McGee management had conducted surveillance of Silkwood's union activities, monitored her communications with reporters and attorneys, and coordinated with corporate security to track her movements in the weeks preceding her death. The memoranda documented corporate awareness that Silkwood possessed evidence that could trigger federal criminal investigation of the fuel rod manufacturing program, result in shutdown of the facility, and expose the company to massive liability for shipping defective nuclear fuel to reactor sites. FBI investigation following Silkwood's death focused on allegations that she had stolen plutonium and contaminated herself, rather than investigating corporate safety violations or the circumstances of her fatal crash, with bureau documents showing coordination with Kerr-McGee security and corporate attorneys that prioritized discrediting Silkwood over examining evidence of corporate criminality and possible homicide. When Silkwood's estate pursued wrongful death litigation, Kerr-McGee deployed legal strategies that restricted access to internal safety records, obtained protective orders sealing corporate communications about plutonium handling procedures, and prevented testimony from workers who had witnessed safety violations and falsification of quality control data. The corporation argued that federal nuclear regulations preempted state tort claims, that internal safety procedures were proprietary trade secrets protected from disclosure, and that plaintiff access to facility records would compromise national security by revealing details of nuclear fuel manufacturing that required Atomic Energy Commission classification. Corporate attorneys successfully sealed depositions from management officials who had supervised the quality control falsification program, prevented discovery of surveillance records documenting monitoring of Silkwood's activities, and blocked testimony from security personnel who had accessed her apartment during periods when plutonium contamination was introduced. The jury in Silkwood versus Kerr-McGee Corporation awarded $10.5 million in punitive damages after finding that the corporation's conduct demonstrated willful and wanton disregard for worker safety. But the verdict was overturned on appeal through legal arguments that federal nuclear regulation preempted state court authority to impose damages for radiation exposure. The appellate reversal prevented enforcement of the jury award and eliminated the precedent that would have established corporate liability for radiation contamination of workers, while the Supreme Court's eventual partial restoration of the verdict was contingent on a sealed settlement agreement that prevented further testimony and restricted public access to evidence of corporate safety violations and quality control falsification. The settlement terms required destruction of plaintiff copies of internal Kerr-McGee documents, prohibited disclosure of corporate safety procedures and contamination incident records, and prevented surviving witnesses from providing testimony to federal investigators about the scope of quality control falsification and deliberate contamination of workers. Government agencies that had regulatory authority over the Cimarron facility destroyed inspection records from the period when Silkwood documented safety violations, classified incident reports describing plutonium contamination events, and sealed investigative files that contained evidence of coordination between Atomic Energy Commission officials and Kerr-McGee management to suppress safety violation documentation. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which inherited regulatory authority from the AEC, restricted access to facility operating records and prevented publication of studies examining contamination incidents at nuclear fuel fabrication sites, maintaining that operational details of plutonium processing required classification to prevent proliferation of sensitive nuclear technology. Federal investigators who examined evidence of possible homicide in Silkwood's death declined to pursue criminal charges. Sealed investigative reports documenting crash scene inconsistencies and classified FBI files containing surveillance records and corporate communications that might prove conspiracy to silence a federal safety whistleblower. Modern attempts to access complete records of the Silkwood case have been blocked through continued classification of nuclear facility safety records, sealed court documents, preventing examination of corporate internal communications, and government restriction of FBI investigative files that remain classified despite Freedom of Information Act requests spanning decades. Academic researchers investigating nuclear industry safety practices are prohibited from accessing Kerr-McGee contamination incident records, prevented from examining quality control falsification documentation, and restricted from studying plutonium exposure data that would demonstrate the extent of worker contamination at nuclear fuel fabrication facilities. The complete evidence proving systematic falsification of nuclear safety records, deliberate contamination of workers, and possible homicide of a federal whistleblower remains locked in classified archives and sealed court files, while the nuclear industry continues to operate under regulatory systems that prevent public access to safety violation documentation and restrict testimony from workers who document dangerous practices that threaten public health and reactor safety. The COINTELPRO conspiracy trials. In 1971, activists calling themselves the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI burglarized the Bureau's field office in Media, Pennsylvania, discovering classified documents marked with the designation COINTELPRO that revealed a decades-long program of illegal domestic surveillance, political infiltration, and psychological warfare operations targeting American citizens who exercised constitutional rights to organize political movements, participate in civil rights activities, and oppose government policies. The stolen documents provided documentary evidence of FBI operations that systematically violated First Amendment protections, fabricated criminal evidence to facilitate prosecutions of political activists, and coordinated with local law enforcement agencies to conduct illegal surveillance, harassment, and intimidation campaigns designed to disrupt lawful political organizations through methods that included anonymous threatening letters, fabricated media stories, and coordination of violent confrontations between targeted groups. The March 8, 1971 burglary yielded files documenting FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover's counterintelligence program operations spanning multiple decades, with specific operational directives describing techniques for infiltrating organizations, recruiting informants to create internal conflicts, and deploying psychological warfare methods to destroy personal relationships, employment prospects, and mental stability of individuals identified as threats to established political and social order. The documents revealed that COINTELPRO operations targeted civil rights leaders, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., anti-war activists, student movements, feminist organizations, and political groups spanning the ideological spectrum, with operational methods that included warrantless surveillance, illegal wiretapping, burglary of private residences and offices, and coordination with media outlets to publish fabricated stories discrediting targeted individuals and organizations. FBI memoranda described operations designed to prevent targeted individuals from speaking publicly, obtaining employment, maintaining marriages, and participating in political activities, with specific directives outlining psychological warfare techniques, including sending fabricated letters to spouses alleging infidelity, creating false evidence of criminal activity, and coordinating with employers to engineer terminations of activists whose political participation threatened Bureau objectives. Congressional investigations triggered by the media documents led to establishment of the Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities, commonly known as the Church Committee, which conducted hearings between 1975 and 1976 that documented thousands of illegal FBI operations. The committee's investigation revealed that COINTELPRO encompassed over 2,000 documented operations targeting more than 500 organizations, with evidence showing FBI coordination with the Central Intelligence Agency, despite statutory prohibitions on domestic intelligence operations by the CIA. Testimony before the committee documented FBI operations that included assassination plots, with specific evidence showing Bureau involvement in the December 1969 raid that killed Black Panther Party leaders Fred Hampton and Mark Clark in Chicago, where FBI infiltrators provided detailed floor plans of Hampton's apartment, drugged him to ensure he remained unconscious during the raid, and coordinated with local police to conduct the assault that resulted in execution-style killings while Hampton slept. Most extraordinary are FBI documents describing operations to destroy political movements through fabricated evidence and coordinated prosecutions, including Bureau creation of anonymous letters designed to provoke violence between rival organizations, fabrication of evidence used in criminal trials against activists, and coordination with prosecutors to obtain convictions based on testimony from paid informants who were directed to provide false testimony. The operational records included detailed planning for psychological operations designed to induce suicide, mental breakdown, and violent confrontation among targeted activists, with specific memoranda describing successful operations that resulted in deaths, imprisonments, and destruction of political organizations that exercised constitutional rights to challenge government policies and advocate for social change. FBI files documented operations spanning from the 1950s through the 1970s, demonstrating that illegal surveillance and disruption campaigns operated continuously across multiple presidential administrations while congressional oversight remained ineffective, and judicial protections proved irrelevant to Bureau operations that systematically violated constitutional protections. The Church Committee investigation documented that FBI Director Hoover ordered destruction of COINTELPRO files in April 1971, immediately after the media burglary exposed the program's existence, with Bureau officials subsequently testifying that approximately 90% of operational records were systematically destroyed to prevent congressional and judicial examination of the full scope of illegal activities. The file destruction eliminated evidence of specific operations, prevented identification of all targeted individuals and organizations, and concealed the complete network of informants, provocateurs, and cooperating agencies that participated in decades of domestic intelligence operations. Surviving documents represented only a fraction of the program's activities, with destroyed files containing evidence of operations that remained completely undocumented after the systematic elimination of Bureau records that would have revealed the full extent of constitutional violations and criminal activities conducted under official FBI authority. When victims of COINTELPRO operations attempted to pursue civil litigation against the FBI and government officials responsible for illegal surveillance and harassment, Justice Department attorneys invoked sovereign immunity doctrines that prevented monetary damages, obtained dismissals based on national security claims that prohibited discovery of operational methods, and sealed court files containing testimony from FBI agents who described specific illegal activities. Federal courts accepted government arguments that exposure of intelligence methods would compromise national security, despite evidence that the methods in question consisted entirely of illegal activities that violated constitutional protections and criminal statutes. Judicial proceedings that survived dismissal resulted in sealed settlements requiring non-disclosure agreements that prevented public testimony about FBI operations, with confidentiality provisions that prohibited victims from describing the harassment, surveillance, and psychological warfare they had documented through discovery in civil litigation. Congressional restrictions imposed after the Church Committee hearings required FBI domestic intelligence operations to obtain judicial approval and operate within constitutional constraints. But subsequent investigations revealed that Bureau surveillance programs continued under different designations while employing methods documented in COINTELPRO operations. Freedom of information. Act litigation spanning decades has forced partial disclosure of additional files, but FBI and Justice Department responses consistently invoke exemptions that protect law enforcement methods, shield informant identities, and classify operational details that remain active in current domestic intelligence programs. Archives containing complete COINTELPRO records remain restricted through classification that prevents comprehensive documentation of the program's scope, targets, and methods, while surviving participants and victims are prohibited through sealed legal agreements from providing complete testimony about operations that systematically violated constitutional rights across multiple decades of domestic political surveillance and disruption. The Manhattan Project Human Experimentation Trials. In 1993, the family of Elmer Allen filed suit against the United States government after Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Eileen Wellsome uncovered classified Manhattan Project documents revealing that Allen had been deliberately injected with plutonium in 1947 at the University of California, San Francisco Hospital as part of secret radiation experiments conducted on American citizens without their knowledge, consent, or any legitimate medical justification. The lawsuit exposed a network of government-sponsored medical experiments spanning 3 decades, where scientists deliberately exposed thousands of civilians to radiation levels that internal documents proved they knew would cause cancer, genetic mutations, and organ failure, while falsifying medical records to conceal the experimental nature of treatments and tracking victims' deteriorating health. Without ever informing them, they had been used as human test subjects in atomic weapons research. Wellsome's investigation identified 18 individuals who received plutonium injections between 1945 and 1947 at medical facilities, including Oak Ridge National Laboratory, Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory, University of Rochester, and University of California hospitals, with government records showing that scientists selected subjects from vulnerable populations, including African American construction workers, mentally disabled patients, and terminal cancer patients who were told they were receiving experimental treatments for their conditions rather than being injected with radioactive materials for weapons research purposes. The injection doses ranged from 4.7 to 6.5 micrograms of plutonium-239, quantities that Manhattan Project health physics calculations had determined would deliver radiation exposure exceeding occupational safety limits by factors of hundreds to thousands, with internal memoranda documenting scientific knowledge that plutonium concentrated in bone tissue, where it would deliver continuous radiation damage for the lifetime of the subject. Medical records showed that researchers conducted repeated biopsies, extracted teeth, and collected urine and fecal samples to measure plutonium distribution and retention in human tissue, while lying to subjects about the purpose of these procedures and falsifying hospital charts to eliminate references to the plutonium administration and radiation monitoring that constituted the actual purpose of the supposed medical care. Research protocols documented in classified files revealed that the experiments were designed to establish radiation exposure standards for Manhattan Project workers by measuring plutonium metabolism in human subjects who were deliberately contaminated, with scientist correspondence acknowledging that the research violated medical ethics by treating human beings as experimental animals while providing no therapeutic benefit to subjects who were deceived about the nature of their participation. The experimental design called for tracking subjects for their entire lifetimes to document cancer development, organ damage, and mortality, with follow-up examinations conducted without informing subjects why government doctors maintained interest in their health decades after their supposed treatment. Death certificates for subjects who died from cancers and organ failures were falsified to list natural causes, eliminating documentation that would reveal government responsibility for radiation-induced diseases, while tissue samples and autopsy materials were retained in classified storage for continued research that measured plutonium retention and radiation, damage in organs harvested from victims who never knew they had been deliberately contaminated. The plutonium injection experiments represented only a fraction of radiation research conducted on human subjects during and after the Manhattan Project. Classified documents revealed that government researchers exposed pregnant women to radioactive iron and iodine to study fetal uptake, fed radioactive materials to mentally disabled children at the Fernald State School in Massachusetts, irradiated prisoners' testicles at Washington State Penitentiary to measure effects on fertility, and conducted whole-body radiation experiments on terminal cancer patients at doses scientists acknowledged exceeded any possible therapeutic benefit. The experiments involved thousands of subjects across dozens of institutions, with research funded by the Atomic Energy Commission and coordinated through classified contracts that required participating doctors and hospitals to maintain secrecy about the radiation exposures, falsify medical records, and provide tissue samples and follow-up data to weapons laboratories that compiled radiation exposure standards based on human experimentation that violated every principle of informed consent and medical ethics. Most extraordinary are internal government memoranda showing that Manhattan Project scientists explicitly compared their human experiments to Nazi medical atrocities, even while the experiments were ongoing, with correspondence from researchers expressing concern that post-war prosecution of German doctors for concentration camp experiments would expose American radiation research to similar criminal liability. Documents from 1947 show Atomic Energy Commission officials recognizing that the plutonium injections would be considered criminal if disclosed, with legal counsel advising that the experiments be classified to prevent prosecution and that all records identifying subjects and describing procedures be restricted under national security classification. The scientists conducting experiments documented their knowledge that subjects were being permanently harmed, that no medical benefit justified the radiation exposures, and that informed consent was impossible because revealing the true nature of the experiments would cause subjects to refuse participation. Yet they continued the research while systematically concealing evidence through medical record falsification and classification of experimental protocols. Following Wellsome's exposure of the plutonium experiments, President Clinton established the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments in 1994 to investigate the scope of government radiation research on human subjects. The committee's investigation documented hundreds of experiments involving thousands of subjects, confirming that researchers routinely deceived subjects about risks, exposed vulnerable populations, including prisoners and mentally disabled individuals who could not provide meaningful consent, and falsified records to conceal experimental procedures. However, the committee's final report acknowledged that complete documentation remained impossible because substantial portions of experimental records had been destroyed, continued to be classified, or existed in fragmentary form that prevented full accounting of the radiation experiment's scope and victim identification. Legal action by radiation experiment victims confronted government invocation of sovereign immunity doctrines that prevented monetary damages for constitutional violations, with Justice Department attorneys arguing that federal researchers conducting classified weapons development could not be held liable for experimental procedures regardless of their violation of medical ethics or constitutional protections. Courts dismissed most lawsuits on sovereign immunity grounds, while settlements in cases that survived preliminary dismissal required confidentiality agreements, preventing public testimony about experimental procedures and prohibited disclosure of classified documents describing the full scope of radiation research. Compensation provided through administrative proceedings rather than judicial awards was limited to subjects who could prove they were specifically included in documented experiments, excluding thousands of additional victims whose participation remained unproven due to destroyed records and continued classification of experimental protocols. Classified documents describing the complete scope of government radiation experiments remain restricted despite declassification initiatives, with substantial portions of Manhattan Project medical research files withheld under exemptions protecting intelligence sources, weapons design information, and privacy of deceased subjects. Universities and medical institutions that hosted radiation experiments have restricted access to clinical records and research files, claiming patient privacy protections and institutional confidentiality. Despite evidence that the records document government-sponsored medical crimes rather than legitimate clinical care, federal agencies continue to classify documents identifying researchers who conducted experiments, institutions that hosted classified research, and specific experimental protocols, preventing comprehensive documentation of radiation research that deliberately exposed American citizens to dangerous radiation levels while systematically deceiving subjects and falsifying medical records to conceal government-sponsored human experimentation conducted under classification that protected criminal activity from disclosure or prosecution. The CIA MKUltra illegal experimentation cases. In 1977, CIA Director Stansfield Turner acknowledged before the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence that the agency had conducted mind control experiments on thousands of unwitting subjects using LSD, sensory deprivation, electroshock therapy, and psychological torture techniques that violated constitutional protections, medical ethics, and international prohibitions against human experimentation. Turner's testimony revealed that CIA Director Richard Helms had ordered destruction of MKUltra program files in 1973, eliminating documentation of experiments that operated through 149 subprojects at more than 80 universities, hospitals, prisons, and pharmaceutical companies across the United States and Canada. With destroyed records containing evidence of research methods, subject identities, and experimental outcomes that would prove the scope of illegal activities conducted under classified CIA authority. The Senate Church Committee's 1975 investigation had discovered surviving MKUltra documents through examination of financial records that escaped the systematic file destruction, with budget documentation revealing contracts for classified research at major universities, including Harvard, Columbia, Stanford, and Cornell, where professors conducted experiments on students, prisoners, and mental patients without informed consent or institutional oversight. The financial records showed CIA expenditures exceeding $25 million for mind control research spanning 2 decades, with contract payments to hundreds of researchers who tested chemical agents, psychological manipulation techniques, and interrogation methods designed to break down human personality, extract information from resistant subjects, and create controllable individuals through pharmaceutical intervention and psychological conditioning. Surviving documents described experiments with LSD doses administered to mental patients who were kept on hallucinogenic drugs for weeks or months, while researchers documented psychotic breaks, personality disintegration, and permanent psychological damage, with experimental protocols calling for maintaining subjects in drug-induced altered states until researchers achieved complete ego dissolution and psychological restructuring. Research conducted under MKUltra contracts included sensory deprivation experiments at McGill University's Allen Memorial Institute, where Dr. Ewan Cameron subjected patients to drug-induced comas lasting weeks, electroshock treatments at voltages exceeding standard psychiatric practice, and repetitive audio message exposure, designed to erase existing memories and implant new behavioral patterns. Cameron's depatterning techniques reduced patients to infantile states, requiring relearning of basic functions, including toilet training and recognition of family members, with CIA documents describing the research as achieving complete personality destruction that enabled psychological reconstruction according to experimental protocols. Patients admitted to the Allen Memorial Institute for treatment of anxiety or depression were subjected to experimental procedures without their knowledge or consent, with hospital records falsified to conceal CIA funding and classify the institution's role as a mind control research facility conducting experiments that deliberately caused permanent brain damage, destroyed careers and families, and left victims unable to function independently after their supposed psychiatric treatment. The MKUltra program included Operation Midnight Climax, where CIA operatives established safe houses in San Francisco and New York, where prostitutes recruited subjects who were secretly dosed with LSD while agency personnel observed their behavior through one-way mirrors. The operation tested drug effects on unwitting subjects in operational settings, documented vulnerability to interrogation during hallucinogenic states, and evaluated whether LSD could facilitate intelligence gathering or create compromised individuals suitable for blackmail and recruitment. Experimental protocols called for administering increasingly large doses to determine thresholds for psychological breakdown, with researchers documenting subjects who experienced permanent psychotic episodes, attempted suicide during drug-induced terror states, and required psychiatric hospitalization after exposure to hallucinogens in doses that deliberately exceeded safety parameters. Prison experiments conducted under MKUltra contracts subjected inmates to LSD, mescaline, barbiturates, and amphetamines in combination regimens designed to test tolerance limits and evaluate pharmaceutical methods for breaking psychological resistance. Dr. Harris Isbell at the Federal Narcotics Research Facility in Lexington, Kentucky, maintained addicts on LSD for 77 consecutive days while measuring psychological effects of sustained hallucinogenic exposure. With protocols that traded continued drug access for participation in experiments that deliberately induced psychotic states, federal prisoners were subjected to electroshock treatments, sensory isolation, and pharmaceutical combinations that produced seizures, unconsciousness, and lasting neurological damage, with research documentation classified to prevent exposure of experiments that treated human subjects as laboratory animals in weapons development research conducted under intelligence agency authority. Most extraordinary are CIA documents showing that agency officials recognized the experiments violated international law, with memoranda from 1947 comparing American radiation and mind control research to Nazi medical experiments, even while approving expanded programs. Internal correspondence described concerns that disclosure of LSD experiments could expose CIA researchers to prosecution, similar to Nuremberg trials of German doctors, with legal analysis concluding that classification provided the only protection against criminal liability for human experimentation, that operated without oversight, violated informed consent requirements, and deliberately caused permanent injury to thousands of subjects. The documents prove that researchers conducting experiments documented their knowledge that subjects were being harmed, that no intelligence value justified the suffering inflicted, and that informed consent would eliminate test populations because revelation of experimental purposes would cause subjects to refuse participation in research designed to break human minds through drugs, isolation, and psychological torture. The death of CIA scientist Frank Olson in 1953 provided direct evidence of MKUltra's lethal consequences. Olson died after falling from a New York hotel window 9 days after unwitting LSD administration during a CIA retreat, with the agency initially concealing both his employment and the circumstances of his death. CIA documents declassified decades later revealed that Olson had been dosed without his knowledge as part of testing whether LSD could compromise security clearances, with his resulting psychological deterioration, including paranoia, severe anxiety, and apparent suicidal ideation, leading to his death under circumstances that his family maintains constituted murder rather than suicide. The Olson family's subsequent lawsuit forced disclosure of additional MKUltra details, but resulted in a settlement requiring confidentiality about classified information the family discovered during litigation. Legal action by MKUltra victims confronted systematic obstacles through government destruction of evidence, classification of experimental details, and invocation of sovereign immunity. The case of Orlikow v. United States, filed by victims of Dr. Cameron's experiments, documented 9 plaintiffs who suffered permanent psychological damage from CIA-funded depatterning procedures. But the lawsuit faced government arguments that Canadian location of experiments eliminated U.S. court jurisdiction, and that national security classification prevented disclosure of operational details. The Canadian government eventually provided settlements of $100,000 to each of 9 families while sealing files and requiring non-disclosure agreements. But thousands of additional victims received no compensation because destroyed records prevented documentation of their participation in experiments that eliminated evidence of subject identities and experimental procedures. CIA admission that Helms destroyed 90% of MKUltra files eliminated possibility of comprehensive victim identification or full documentation of experimental scope. Surviving financial records suggest thousands of subjects participated in experiments whose details remain unknown because systematic file destruction concealed research conducted at institutions that cannot be identified and involving methods that were deliberately erased from CIA records. Courts dismissed most victim lawsuits on sovereign immunity grounds, while accepting government claims that disclosure of intelligence methods would compromise national security, despite the acknowledged criminal nature of experiments that violated domestic and international law. Current CIA classification maintains restrictions on files, identifying researchers, institutions, and subjects involved in mind control experiments. Universities and medical facilities that hosted MKUltra research restrict access to records documenting their participation in illegal experimentation. The complete scope of CIA mind control programs remains concealed through classification that protects criminal activities from accountability while preventing victims from proving their participation in experiments that destroyed lives under intelligence operations that continue under different designations. The Roswell Incident Congressional Investigation. In 1994, New Mexico Congressman Stephen Schiff demanded that the Government Accountability Office investigate the U.S. Army Air Force's recovery of materials and bodies from a crash site near Roswell in July 1947, after constituents presented evidence that military personnel had described debris exhibiting properties inconsistent with any terrestrial aircraft, and that base officials had issued press releases announcing recovery of a flying disc before rapidly retracting the statement and substituting a weather balloon explanation. The GAO investigation revealed that the Army Air Force had destroyed outgoing messages and communications logs from Roswell Army Airfield, covering the critical period of the incident, eliminating documentation that would reveal what military personnel recovered, where materials were transported, and why initial press announcements describing a captured flying disc were replaced within hours by claims that misidentification of weather equipment had caused the confusion. The original July 8, 1947 press release, issued by Roswell Army Airfield Public Information Officer Walter Haut, announced that personnel from the 509th Bomb Group, the only atomic weapons-capable unit in the U.S. military, had recovered a flying disc from a ranch northwest of Roswell. Base Commander Colonel William Blanchard authorized the press release after Intelligence Officer Major Jesse Marcel supervised recovery operations that collected debris scattered across a debris field measuring 3/4 of a mile long. Within hours of the announcement's publication in newspapers across the country, 8th Air Force Commander General Roger Ramey held a press conference in Fort Worth displaying weather balloon debris and announcing that Marcel had misidentified routine meteorological equipment, with photographs showing Marcel posing with balloon material that he later testified bore no resemblance to the anomalous debris he had actually collected from the crash site. Marcel's subsequent testimony described debris properties that included thin metal foil that could not be dented with a sledgehammer and returned to its original shape after being crumpled. Structural beams inscribed with hieroglyphic-like symbols that did not correspond to any known language or military markings, and fiber optic-like filaments decades before such technology was developed. His descriptions included materials that exhibited self-healing properties when damaged, demonstrated extreme strength while remaining extraordinarily lightweight, and displayed characteristics that exceeded metallurgical capabilities available in 1947. Marcel maintained until his death in 1986 that the debris he recovered did not originate from any weather balloon, military project, or terrestrial technology, with his testimony corroborated by hundreds of witnesses, including rancher Mac Brazel, who discovered the debris field, military personnel who participated in recovery operations, and Roswell residents who observed unusual military activity and saw debris that exhibited impossible properties. Testimony from mortician Glenn Dennis described being contacted by the base hospital requesting child-sized coffins, observing unusual military activity at the base hospital, and being threatened by military personnel after speaking with a nurse who described conducting autopsies on small humanoid bodies that exhibited non-human anatomical features. The nurse, whom Dennis identified as Lieutenant Naomi Self, provided him with sketches of the bodies before being transferred from the base and disappearing from all military records, with Army personnel records showing no evidence of her service, despite corroboration from other witnesses who confirmed her presence at the base hospital. Multiple witnesses described seeing debris transported under armed guard, observing bodies being loaded into aircraft for transport to Wright Field in Ohio, and being threatened with prosecution, imprisonment, or death if they discussed what they had observed, with military personnel reporting that security officers warned them their families would be killed if they revealed details of recovery operations. The GAO investigation discovered that administrative records, outgoing message traffic, and communications logs that would document the Roswell incident had been destroyed without authorization, violating records retention requirements that mandated permanent preservation of documents from this period. The destruction eliminated evidence of what was recovered, where materials were sent, who authorized recovery operations, and why initial flying disc announcements were retracted. Air Force responses to GAO inquiries claimed that records destruction occurred during routine administrative procedures, but could not explain why only documents covering the specific period of the Roswell incident were eliminated, while records from earlier and later periods survived in archives. In 1994, the Air Force released a report claiming that Roswell debris came from Project Mogul, a classified balloon array designed to detect Soviet nuclear tests. However, Project Mogul employed standard weather balloons and radar reflectors, components that Marcel would have immediately recognized through his extensive experience with meteorological and radar equipment. The Mogul explanation contradicted witness descriptions of debris properties, failed to account for body recovery testimonies, and could not explain why routine balloon equipment would require armed transport, massive debris field cleanup operations, and threats against military personnel who observed the incident. A 1997 Air Force report attempted to address body recovery testimonies by claiming witnesses threes had confused the 1947 incident with crash test dummy drops conducted in the 1950s, requiring witnesses to confuse events separated by nearly a decade, and suggesting that military personnel with security clearances could not distinguish between bodies and test dummies. The report dismissed hundreds of consistent testimonies while providing no explanation for destroyed records, classification of witness statements, or documentation showing military personnel were threatened with prosecution for discussing observations. Classification of witness testimonies continues to prevent comprehensive documentation of the incident. Military personnel who provided testimony to investigators described receiving warnings that their statements remained classified, with security officials invoking national security restrictions that prevented public disclosure of their observations. Surviving witnesses report that attempts to provide sworn testimony have been blocked through invocation of security clearances that remain active decades after the incident, with retired military officers claiming they remain bound by secrecy oaths that prevent them from revealing details of recovery operations, debris properties, and body descriptions. Air Force files documenting the Roswell incident remain classified under exemptions protecting intelligence sources and methods. The National Archives maintains restricted files containing witness testimonies, recovery operation logs, and analysis reports that cannot be accessed without security clearances that prevent independent researchers from examining documentation. Modern investigations are prohibited from accessing radar tracking data, flight logs from transport aircraft, and analysis reports from laboratories that examined recovered materials, with military and intelligence agencies maintaining that exposure of operational details would compromise ongoing national security programs. The Kennedy Assassination Record Suppression. In 1992, Congress established the Assassination Records Review Board through the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act after Oliver Stone's film, JFK, revealed that thousands of government documents about the November 22, 1963 murder remained classified 3 decades after President Kennedy's death in Dealey Plaza. The ARRB investigation uncovered systematic withholding of more than 60,000 CIA, FBI, and military intelligence files, destroyed photographic evidence from the assassination scene, missing autopsy materials, including brain tissue and photographs, and classified testimonies from witnesses who described multiple shooters, coordination between intelligence agencies, and evidence contradicting the Warren Commission's conclusion that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone in killing the president. Congressional mandate required release of all assassination-related documents by 2017, but CIA and FBI responses to ARRB document requests revealed that agencies had destroyed critical evidence, maintained classification on files describing Oswald's activities before the assassination, and withheld documents under national security exemptions that prevented disclosure of intelligence operations and source protection methods. CIA destruction of surveillance photographs from the agency's Mexico City station eliminated visual documentation of Oswald's visit to Soviet and Cuban embassies in September 1963, with agency officials testifying that photographs were destroyed through routine procedures despite standing orders to maintain all materials related to individuals who later became subjects of criminal investigation or national security interest. The destroyed photographs would have documented Oswald's contacts, confirmed or refuted his presence at embassy locations, and provided evidence about whether he acted in coordination with intelligence services or foreign governments during the weeks before Kennedy's assassination. FBI destruction of physical evidence included a note Oswald delivered to the Dallas field office approximately 2 weeks before the assassination, with the note destroyed by Assistant Special Agent in Charge James Hosty after Oswald's death on orders from Special Agent in Charge Gordon Shanklin. Hosty testified that he flushed the note down a toilet after being instructed to eliminate evidence that the FBI had contact with Oswald before the assassination, with Bureau officials later acknowledging the destruction violated evidence retention protocols, but claiming the note contained only threats against the FBI rather than information relevant to assassination investigation. The destruction eliminated evidence of Oswald's state of mind, his relationship with federal law enforcement, and potential warnings about his activities that were ignored or suppressed by agents who failed to place him on security watch lists despite his defection to the Soviet Union, pro-Castro political activities, and contact with Cuban intelligence operatives. Alteration of autopsy materials documented by ARRB testimony included missing brain tissue, substituted photographs, and destroyed original records from Kennedy's examination at Bethesda Naval Hospital. Autopsy photographer Sawandra Spencer testified that photographs in the National Archives differed from images she developed on the night of the autopsy, with official photographs showing different wound characteristics and camera angles than those she remembered processing in the White House photo lab. Her testimony suggested that autopsy photographs had been altered or substituted to support single-shooter conclusions, while original images showing wound trajectories inconsistent with shots from the Texas School Book Depository were eliminated from the official record. Brain tissue that would have enabled precise trajectory analysis through examination of bullet tracks disappeared from National Archives storage, with the missing material eliminating physical evidence that could prove whether shots came from multiple directions or whether Kennedy was killed by a single assassin firing from behind. Warren Commission executive sessions, where commissioners discussed evidence and witness credibility, remained classified until ARRB pressure forced partial release of transcripts, showing that commissioners privately expressed doubts about single-shooter conclusions, while publicly maintaining certainty that Oswald acted alone. The classified transcripts revealed discussions of witness testimony describing shots from the grassy knoll in front of Kennedy's motorcade, acknowledgement that Oswald's military marksmanship scores suggested he lacked skills necessary for the shooting attributed to him, and concerns that intelligence agencies were withholding information about Oswald's intelligence connections. Commission members discussed evidence suggesting conspiracy, but agreed to emphasize conclusions supporting the lone gunman theory, with classified portions of their deliberations showing that political considerations influenced their public findings, despite private acknowledgement of unresolved evidence and witness testimonies that contradicted official conclusions. Most extraordinary are CIA files on Oswald's activities that remain classified despite legal mandates requiring release. The agency's 201 personality file on Oswald, which tracks individuals of intelligence interest, contains classified documents describing his defection to the Soviet Union, return to the United States, contacts with pro-Castro organizations, and activities in New Orleans and Dallas during the months before the assassination. CIA claims that portions of the Oswald file require continued classification to protect intelligence sources and methods, suggesting that declassification would reveal agency operational details about surveillance of Oswald or relationships with individuals connected to him. The classification prevents documentation of whether Oswald operated as an intelligence asset, received guidance from agency personnel, or was monitored as a security threat whose activities were tracked but not interdicted before he allegedly assassinated the president. House Select Committee on Assassinations investigation in 1979 concluded that Kennedy was probably assassinated as a result of conspiracy based on acoustic evidence suggesting 4 shots rather than 3, and testimony indicating coordination beyond Oswald's actions. The committee's findings contradicted Warren Commission conclusions, but resulted in sealed testimony and classified files that prevented public examination of evidence supporting conspiracy determination. Grand jury materials, witness testimonies, and investigative files from the House investigation remain sealed, with continued classification preventing verification of the committee's conspiracy findings and access to evidence that challenged lone assassin conclusions. National Archives Administration of Assassination Records maintains classification on approximately 15,000 documents that were subject to postponement under provisions allowing agencies to withhold materials threatening national security, foreign relations, or intelligence operations. Release dates have been repeatedly extended, with President Trump's 2017 order requiring disclosure resulting in continued withholding of thousands of files that CIA and FBI claimed would expose sensitive sources and methods. Subsequent extensions postponed release until 2021, then 2029, with agencies indicating that portions of assassination files may require permanent classification to protect intelligence operations that remain active or would compromise foreign relationships if exposed through historical document disclosure. Classified files prevent comprehensive documentation of intelligence agency surveillance of Oswald, relationships between federal law enforcement and the alleged assassin, and evidence of coordination suggesting conspiracy. The continued withholding demonstrates that government agencies maintain classification authority over materials that could resolve fundamental questions about Kennedy's assassination. Despite congressional mandates requiring disclosure, and despite acknowledgement that legitimate national security concerns do not justify permanent concealment of evidence about events occurring more than 6 decades ago. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study litigation. In 1972, Associated Press reporter Jean Heller exposed a public health service experiment that had deliberately withheld syphilis treatment from 399 black men in Macon County, Alabama, for 40 years, while government doctors documented their deterioration through tertiary syphilis stages, including blindness, dementia, cardiovascular damage, and death. The study subjects were told they were receiving treatment for bad blood, a local term for various ailments, while physicians conducting the research systematically prevented them from accessing penicillin after it became the standard cure for syphilis in 1947, ensuring that the disease would progress untreated so that researchers could observe and document the complete pathology of untreated infection across decades of unnecessary suffering that could have been eliminated through administration of widely available antibiotics. The experiment began in 1932 under direction of the U.S. Public Health Service in cooperation with the Tuskegee Institute, recruiting 399 black men who had contracted syphilis and 201 control subjects who were free of infection. Researchers led by Dr. Talia Farrow Clark designed the study to observe the natural progression of untreated syphilis in black male subjects, based on racist medical theories claiming that syphilis affected different races differently, and that documentation of the disease in black populations would provide scientific knowledge that justified differential treatment protocols. Study participants were recruited with promises of free medical care, meals, and burial insurance, but were never informed they had syphilis, were participating in medical research, or that effective treatment for their condition existed and was being deliberately withheld while government doctors monitored their progressive physical and neurological deterioration. Public Health Service coordination with local medical providers ensured that study subjects could not obtain treatment from other sources. Researchers contacted private physicians, hospitals, and public health clinics throughout Macon County, instructing them to refuse syphilis treatment to men enrolled in the study, with medical professionals cooperating to create a systematic denial of care that trapped subjects in untreated disease progression. regardless of where they sought medical assistance. The coordination extended to draft boards during World War II, where PHS officials intervened to prevent 256 study subjects from receiving military induction examinations that would have detected their syphilis and resulted in mandatory treatment, ensuring that participants remained untreated so that the study could continue documenting disease progression through stages that produced cardiovascular lesions, central nervous system damage, and death from complications that would have been prevented through penicillin administration that was systematically denied. Study protocols required extensive medical monitoring of subjects without ever providing therapeutic intervention. Researchers conducted spinal taps under the guise of special free treatment, subjecting participants to painful lumbar punctures that provided no medical benefit while enabling documentation of neurosyphilis development in subjects who believed they were receiving advanced medical care. Death certificates for study participants who died from syphilis complications were falsified to attribute mortality to natural causes, rather than infections that killed them. Because government doctors deliberately prevented treatment, with the falsified records concealing public health service responsibility for deaths that resulted from systematic denial of medical care over 4 decades of documented observation. The study continued through multiple decades and different PHS leadership, with researchers publishing findings in medical journals that described observing disease progression in untreated subjects without acknowledging that treatment was deliberately withheld rather than naturally unavailable. Medical literature citations documented cardiovascular syphilis rates, neurological deterioration patterns, and mortality. Timelines in populations described as having no access to treatment, when in fact, the research design required systematic preventions of treatment to maintain untreated control populations whose suffering was necessary for generating publishable data about syphilis pathology in black male subjects who were deliberately condemned to unnecessary death and disability. Infection of family members resulted from the systematic denial of treatment. Wives contracted syphilis from untreated subjects, with researchers documenting but not preventing transmission to spouses who were condemned to infection. Because treating study participants would have eliminated the untreated disease progression that constituted the research objective. At least 40 wives were infected through marital contact with untreated subjects, while 19 children were born with congenital syphilis because researchers prioritized observational data over preventing transmission to infants who developed blindness, deafness, bone deformities, and neurological damage that resulted from maternal infection that could have been eliminated through treatment of study participants. Peter Buxton, a public health service investigator, filed formal complaints about the study's ethics in 1966 after discovering that treatment was being deliberately withheld from subjects who could be cured with penicillin. His complaints to PHS officials resulted in formation of an internal review panel that determined the study should continue, with recommendations that treatment continue to be withheld so that observation of complete disease progression could be documented through autopsy examination of subjects whose deaths from untreated syphilis would provide final data points for the research program. Buxton's subsequent disclosure to the Associated Press in 1972 forced public exposure of the study after internal whistleblowing, failed to terminate research that government officials determined was valuable enough to justify continued observation of preventable suffering and death. Following public exposure, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare convened an ad hoc advisory panel that determined the study was ethically unjustified and medically unnecessary. However, class action litigation filed by study survivors and victims' families confronted government invocation of sovereign immunity that prevented monetary damages for constitutional violations and medical malpractice. The case of Pollard v. United States resulted in a settlement providing $10 million distributed among survivors and heirs. But the settlement terms were sealed to prevent public examination of the evidence and testimony that documented knowing infliction of harm, systematic denial of treatment, and deliberate infection of family members through research protocols that violated every principle of medical ethics while operating under federal government authority. Destruction of complete study records, eliminated comprehensive documentation of all participants, the full scope of medical monitoring conducted over 4 decades, and correspondence showing institutional knowledge that the research violated ethical standards that prohibited human experimentation without informed consent. Sealed depositions from surviving researchers prevented public testimony about how the study continued through multiple decades despite growing ethical concerns, why family members were deliberately exposed to infection, and what institutional approval processes authorized systematic denial of life-saving treatment to hundreds of men who died from preventable disease because government doctors prioritized research data over human life. Presidential apology by Bill Clinton in 1997 acknowledged that the study was racist and unethical, but did not include disclosure of complete documentation proving institutional knowledge, approval chains authorizing continuation of the research, or files showing coordination between public health service officials and medical providers who systematically prevented treatment. Classification of documents describing review processes that authorized continuation of the study prevents examination of how federal health officials justified deliberate denial of treatment, while sealed settlement terms restrict testimony about the full scope of suffering inflicted through medical research that deliberately caused death and disability across 4 decades of government-sponsored human experimentation on vulnerable populations selected based on race and poverty. The Iran-Contra conspiracy trials. In 1987, congressional hearings exposed a covert government operation that illegally sold weapons to Iran in violation of arms embargo policies and diverted profits to fund Nicaraguan Contra rebels despite congressional prohibitions on military aid to the insurgency. Evidence presented during testimony revealed that National Security Council staff coordinated with CIA operatives to establish secret Swiss bank accounts, arrange arms shipments through Israeli intermediaries, and transport weapons to Central America while maintaining plausible deniability through destruction of documentation and use of private contractors who conducted operations outside official government channels. The criminal prosecutions that followed documented systematic destruction of evidence, with NSC staff member Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North admitting under oath that he shredded more than 5,000 pages of documents detailing arms sales, fund transfers, and operational coordination, eliminating records that would prove the scope of illegal activities conducted with authorization from officials at the highest levels of the Reagan administration. Congressional investigation began after Nicaraguan forces shot down a cargo plane carrying weapons to Contra forces in October 1986, capturing American crew member Eugene Hasenfuss, whose testimony described CIA coordination of weapons flights from El Salvador to Contra bases in Honduras and Nicaragua. Hasenfuss identified agency personnel who supervised resupply operations, provided intelligence support for weapons deliveries, and maintained operational security for flights that violated Congressional Boland Amendment restrictions prohibiting military assistance to forces attempting to overthrow Nicaragua's Sandinista government. His capture forced acknowledgement of covert operations that the administration had denied, triggering investigations that revealed an elaborate network of arms sales, secret bank accounts, and document destruction designed to conceal illegal activities from congressional oversight and public scrutiny. Tower Commission investigation appointed by President Reagan to examine National Security Council involvement documented that NSC staff had operated a private covert action capability outside normal intelligence channels, with operations directed by National Security Advisor John Poindexter and implemented by North through coordination with private arms dealers, foreign governments, and CIA assets. The Commission's report detailed arms sales to Iran totaling millions of dollars, with proceeds deposited in secret enterprise accounts controlled by retired Air Force Major General Richard Secord and businessman Albert Hakim. Financial records showed that weapon sales generated profits exceeding costs, by factors enabling diversion of funds to contra-military operations, humanitarian aid organizations that served as fronts for weapons purchases, and operational expenses for covert activities that evaded congressional appropriations processes and legal restrictions on executive branch actions. North's testimony before Congress in July 1987 provided detailed acknowledgement of document destruction, with North stating that he shredded materials on orders from superiors who sought to eliminate evidence of operations that violated congressional mandates and administration policy statements, denying involvement in Contra support. His secretary, Fawn Hall, testified that she assisted in destroying documents and smuggled classified materials from NSC offices by hiding them in her clothing to prevent their seizure by investigators, with both acknowledging that systematic elimination of records prevented comprehensive documentation of operational scope, financial transactions, and authorization chains that would prove illegal activities extended to cabinet officials and potentially the president. North's testimony included acknowledgement of coordination with drug traffickers who transported cocaine to the United States as part of the weapon supply network. Testimony and subsequent investigations documented that Contra forces engaged in drug smuggling to finance military operations, with aircraft that delivered weapons to Central America returning to the United States carrying cocaine that was distributed through networks operated by traffickers who received protection from prosecution in exchange for supporting Contra resupply operations. DEA and Customs investigations of drug trafficking were blocked when subjects claimed CIA affiliation, with law enforcement agencies reporting that operational security considerations prevented interdiction of narcotic shipments that were protected by intelligence agency equities in maintaining supply lines to Contra forces. San Jose Mercury News reporter Gary Webb's 1996 Dark Alliance series documented connections between CIA-backed Contras and cocaine distribution networks in Los Angeles, with evidence showing that traffickers with agency protection imported tons of cocaine that fueled the crack epidemic in American cities during the 1980s. Webb's reporting linked Nicaraguan traffickers Danilo Blandon and Norwin Meneses to major cocaine distribution operations, documented their CIA connections, and proved that drug proceeds funded weapons purchases for Contra forces. The series forced CIA Inspector General investigation that confirmed agency knowledge of Contra drug trafficking, with the 1998 report acknowledging that CIA had relationships with dozens of Contra-related individuals and organizations involved in drug trade, and that agency, officers, failed to report drug trafficking to law enforcement as required by regulations. Criminal prosecutions resulted in indictments of 14 officials and convictions of 11 individuals, including North, Poindexter, former National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane, Assistant Secretary of State Elliot Abrams, and CIA officials who coordinated covert operations. However, convictions were overturned on appeal based on claims that immunized congressional testimony had tainted prosecutions, eliminating accountability for officials who admitted conducting illegal operations. Independent counsel. Lawrence Walsh's investigation documented systematic obstruction of justice through document destruction, false testimony, and coordination among officials to conceal evidence. But prosecutions were terminated through presidential pardons issued by George H.W. Bush in December 1992 that eliminated criminal liability for 6 officials, including former Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger, whose trial would have required testimony about high-level authorization of illegal activities. The pardons eliminated possibility of trials that would have forced disclosure of classified documents proving knowledge and authorization at cabinet and presidential levels. Weinberger's indictment included charges of lying to Congress about knowledge of arms sales, with his personal notes documenting meetings where arms for hostages exchanges were discussed and approved by senior administration officials. His trial would have required declassification of memoranda, meeting notes, and communications, proving that illegal operations were known and authorized by officials who publicly denied involvement, but the pardon prevented disclosure of evidence that remained classified under national security. Exemptions: grand jury materials, witness testimonies, and investigative files from Iran-Contra prosecutions remain sealed under court orders that prevent public examination of evidence presented to grand juries and testimony provided during criminal proceedings. Classified portions of the Tower Commission report, Congressional Iran-Contra Committee findings, and independent counsel investigation files contain details about operational authorization, CIA involvement in drug trafficking protection, and financial transactions that remain withheld under exemptions protecting intelligence sources and methods. The sealed and classified materials prevent comprehensive documentation of how covert operations were authorized, the extent of CIA coordination with drug traffickers, and the scope of document destruction that eliminated evidence of criminal activities. CIA Inspector General reports on agency knowledge of Contra drug trafficking were suppressed for years before partial release, with classified volumes containing details about specific operations, identified traffickers with CIA protection, and communications between agency officers and headquarters describing narcotic shipments that were allowed to proceed without law enforcement interdiction. Current classification maintains restrictions on files documenting CIA operational relationships with traffickers, prevents access to communications showing agency knowledge of cocaine importation, and conceals evidence proving that drug trafficking was tolerated and protected to maintain weapon supply networks that operated in violation of congressional prohibitions and administration policy statements. The BCCI banking conspiracy investigation. In 1991, banking regulators in 7 countries simultaneously seized operations of the Bank of Credit and Commerce International after discovering that the institution functioned as a criminal enterprise that laundered narcotics proceeds for drug cartels, financed international terrorism, maintained secret accounts for intelligence agencies, including the CIA, and facilitated arms trafficking through a global network of 400 branches operating in 73 countries. Congressional investigation led by Senator John Kerry revealed that U.S. officials had possessed knowledge of BCCI's criminal operations for years, but prevented prosecution to protect intelligence relationships, while federal regulatory agencies, including the Federal Reserve and Justice Department, systematically blocked investigations that would have exposed CIA use of the bank for covert operations funding and money laundering activities that served agency objectives while enabling massive fraud that ultimately cost depositors more than $20 billion in missing funds. BCCI's operations from its 1972 founding until its 1991 collapse created what prosecutors described as the largest bank fraud in history, with the institution serving as a financial services provider for drug cartels, arms dealers, terrorists, and intelligence agencies that required banking facilities capable of moving money outside conventional regulatory oversight. The bank maintained accounts for Colombian cocaine traffickers, including the Medellin cartel, processed transactions for arms shipments to Middle Eastern conflicts, financed terrorist organizations, and provided CIA with off-book accounts that enabled covert operations funding without congressional appropriations, oversight, or accounting requirements that would create paper trails documenting intelligence activities. Pakistani Intelligence Service ISI maintained accounts at BCCI for operations including support of Afghan Mujahideen forces, while the bank served as financial facilitator for operations that required untraceable funding sources and transaction processing that evaded regulatory scrutiny. Senator Kerry's Subcommittee on Terrorism, Narcotics, and International Operations conducted investigation between 1988 and 1992 that documented BCCI's role in money laundering, its relationships with intelligence agencies, and the systematic failure of U.S. regulatory and law enforcement agencies to act on evidence of criminal activities. The committee's investigation revealed that CIA maintained accounts at BCCI, that agency officers used the bank for operations funding, and that intelligence equities prevented law enforcement action against an institution that was laundering billions of dollars while serving as a financial hub for international criminal networks. Testimony documented that Customs, DEA, and FBI investigations of BCCI were blocked when subjects claimed intelligence connections, with law enforcement officials reporting that they were instructed to terminate inquiries that threatened to expose CIA banking relationships. New York District Attorney Robert Morgenthau's prosecution of BCCI operations resulted in guilty pleas and fines. But federal authorities prevented comprehensive criminal proceedings that would have required testimony about CIA accounts and intelligence agency use of the bank's criminal infrastructure. Justice Department handling of BCCI prosecution emphasized financial fraud while avoiding examination of intelligence connections, with plea agreements sealed to prevent disclosure of testimony describing agency accounts, operational funding, and coordination between bank officials and CIA personnel who utilized BCCI services for covert activities that required banking facilities outside regulatory oversight and congressional scrutiny. Federal Reserve investigation revealed that BCCI had secretly acquired control of First American Bank and other U.S. financial institutions through nominee arrangements that concealed ownership while violating banking regulations prohibiting foreign control of domestic banks. The acquisitions enabled BCCI to operate within the U.S. banking system while conducting money laundering and fraud, with Federal Reserve officials subsequently acknowledging that they failed to act on warnings about BCCI's criminal nature and its secret acquisition of American banks. Clark Clifford and Robert Altman, who served as attorneys and executives for First American Bank, were indicted on charges of facilitating BCCI's illegal acquisition and accepting bribes. But criminal proceedings resulted in settlements rather than trials that would have forced disclosure of intelligence agency knowledge and approval of BCCI's operations within the United States. Congressional investigation documented that State Department, Treasury, Justice Department, and Federal Reserve all received information about BCCI's criminal activities during the 1980s, but failed to coordinate effective regulatory or law enforcement response. The failure enabled BCCI to continue operations for years after evidence of money laundering, fraud, and intelligence relationships should have triggered shutdown, with the delay resulting in billions of dollars in additional losses to depositors whose funds were stolen, while regulatory agencies protected intelligence equities over enforcement of banking laws and fraud statutes. Most extraordinary are classified CIA files describing the agency's operational use of BCCI accounts and the protection of bank operations to preserve intelligence capabilities. The files document agency knowledge that BCCI was laundering drug money, facilitating arms trafficking, and conducting massive fraud while CIA maintained accounts and relationships that enabled covert operations funding outside congressional oversight. Intelligence officials testified in classified sessions that BCCI provided essential services for operations that could not be conducted through legitimate banking channels, with the testimony revealing that protection of intelligence capabilities was prioritized over law enforcement action against criminal activities that cost depositors billions while serving terrorists, drug cartels, and arms traffickers. Sealed plea agreements with BCCI officials and cooperating institutions prevent public access to testimony describing CIA accounts, operational funding mechanisms, and coordination between intelligence personnel and bank officials. The agreements required confidentiality about classified information and intelligence relationships in exchange for reduced penalties, eliminating possibility of public testimony that would document the scope of CIA use of criminal banking infrastructure. Bank of America and other institutions that had relationships with BCCI entered sealed settlements that prevented disclosure of their knowledge about the bank's criminal nature and intelligence connections. Destruction of bank records in multiple countries eliminated comprehensive documentation of transactions, account holders, and operational details. Records that would prove specific CIA transactions, identify intelligence personnel who maintained accounts, and document coordination between agency officers and bank officials. were destroyed during BCCI's collapse or remain classified under exemptions protecting intelligence sources and methods. The destroyed and classified materials prevent full accounting of how BCCI served intelligence operations, the extent of CIA knowledge about criminal activities, and the decision-making that prioritized intelligence capabilities over law enforcement action against an institution that defrauded depositors of billions while serving international criminal networks. Federal agencies continue to restrict access to files documenting BCCI operations, intelligence relationships, and regulatory failures that enabled the fraud to continue for years after criminal activities were documented. Justice Department files describing CIA coordination with the bank remain classified. Grand jury materials from BCCI investigations are sealed. The complete record of government protection of criminal banking operations that served intelligence agencies while costing depositors billions remains concealed through classification and sealed legal proceedings that prevent accountability for officials who systematically blocked prosecution of the largest bank fraud in history. The Operation Northwoods False Flag Conspiracy. In 1997, the John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Review Board declassified a March 13, 1962 memorandum from the Joint Chiefs of Staff proposing that the Department of Defense conduct terrorist attacks against American citizens and military targets to fabricate justification for invasion of Cuba. The document titled Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba contained detailed operational plans for bombing U.S. cities, sinking American ships at Guantanamo Bay, staging hijackings of civilian aircraft, and orchestrating a campaign of terrorism in Washington, D.C. and Miami that would kill American civilians while creating false evidence, blaming Cuban forces for attacks that were actually conducted by U.S. military personnel operating under orders from the highest levels of military command. The memorandum, authored by Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Lyman Lemnitzer and signed by each service chief, outlined specific attack scenarios, including blowing up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay Harbor, using methods that would appear to be external sabotage, conducting attacks on the base itself to create casualties among military personnel and dependents, and developing a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area and other Florida cities that would target Cuban refugees and American civilians. The proposals included detailed planning for fabricating evidence, with operational suggestions calling for creation of false casualty lists, manufacturing of physical evidence linking attacks to Cuban operatives, and coordination with CIA to establish apparent connections between terrorist incidents and Castro's government through planted documents, manufactured witness testimonies, and controlled media reporting that would present fabricated attacks as genuine Cuban aggression. Specific operational plans documented in the memorandum included sinking a boatload of Cuban refugees en route to Florida, staging attacks on U.S. military installations abroad that could be attributed to Cuban saboteurs, and conducting a Remember the Maine incident by blowing up a U.S. Navy vessel in Guantanamo Bay while generating false casualty reports that would inflame public opinion and create political pressure for military intervention. The plans called for actual destruction of American property and loss of American lives, with casualty calculations explicitly included in operational planning as necessary elements for generating sufficient public outrage to justify invasion. The Joint Chiefs determined that genuine U.S. casualties were required to create political conditions enabling military action, acknowledging that fabricated attacks without actual American deaths would insufficient to generate the level of public support necessary for full-scale invasion of Cuba. Additional proposals included staging the shoot-down of a civilian airliner, with plans calling for creation of a false passenger manifest, including college students on vacation, development of obituary notices for fake victims, and coordination of investigations that would produce fabricated evidence linking the attack to Cuban military forces. Alternative aircraft attack scenarios included staging an attack on a CIA aircraft disguised as a civilian charter flight, shooting down the aircraft over Cuban waters, and conducting search and rescue operations that would discover manufactured evidence proving Cuban military responsibility. The operational planning included detailed timelines, SHE-source requirements, and coordination procedures among Defense Department, CIA, and other agencies that would participate in executing false flag attacks designed to manipulate public opinion and create justification for military invasion. The memorandum outlined a broader campaign of fabricated incidents, including planning evidence of Cuban involvement in subversive activities throughout the Caribbean, manufacturing proof of Cuban arms shipments to insurgents in other nations, staging riots at Guantanamo Bay that would be blamed on Cuban provocateurs, and creating a wave of communist Cuban terrorism throughout the United States that would target infrastructure, businesses, and civilian populations while generating political pressure for decisive military action. The comprehensive nature of the proposals demonstrated that senior military leadership had developed systematic planning for terrorist attacks on American population as routine military contingency preparation with multiple operational variations provided to enable selection of attack scenarios most likely to achieve political objectives. President Kennedy received the Northwoods proposals through Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who forwarded the Joint Chiefs recommendations for presidential approval. Kennedy rejected the plans and removed Lemnitzer as chairman of the Joint Chiefs shortly thereafter, reassigning him to European command in what was understood as punishment for proposing terrorist attacks on American citizens. However, the proposals themselves were classified top secret and remained concealed from public knowledge for 35 years, with no congressional oversight, judicial examination, or public accountability for military leadership that had proposed killing Americans to justify war. The 1997 declassification occurred through ARRB investigation of Kennedy assassination records rather than through routine document review, suggesting that Operation Northwoods would have remained classified indefinitely without the board's mandate to examine files related to Kennedy's presidency. The memorandum's release revealed that false flag attack planning existed at the highest levels of military command, that senior officers proposed terrorism against American citizens as legitimate military operations, and that similar contingency plans likely existed for other scenarios requiring manufactured justification for military action. Examination of the Gulf of Tonkin incident that provided justification for escalation of the Vietnam War has raised questions about whether Northwood-style false flag operations were implemented despite Kennedy's rejection. The 1964 incident involving reported attacks on U.S. destroyers in international waters has been documented as involving significant fabrication and exaggeration with declassified NSA histories, acknowledging that the second attack that triggered congressional authorization for expanded military action never occurred. The parallels between Northwood's proposals and the manufactured Gulf of Tonkin incident suggest that false flag planning continued and was implemented to create justification for military operations. Classification continues to prevent access to related contingency plans for false flag operations targeting other nations or scenarios. Pentagon files describing similar proposals remain restricted under national security exemptions. National Security Council discussions of the Northwoods proposals are sealed, preventing documentation of how senior civilian officials responded to military recommendations for terrorist attacks on American citizens. The continued classification demonstrates that false flag operational planning extends beyond the single declassified memorandum, with additional proposals and potentially implemented operations remaining concealed through permanent restrictions on military contingency files that document planning for attacks on American population as instruments of foreign policy. Conclusion: these 10 court cases represent documented legal proceedings where extraordinary evidence was presented under oath, authenticated through judicial examination, and verified by expert witnesses, then systematically suppressed through classification orders, sealed testimonies, and destruction of records to prevent public awareness of government crimes and institutional conspiracies. From nuclear industry falsification and domestic surveillance programs to radiation experiments, mind control research, and false flag terrorist planning. These judicial proceedings documented evidence of systematic institutional criminality that was brought before courts, examined by judges, and verified through legal processes before being deliberately hidden from the citizens whose rights were violated and whose government betrayed constitutional principles through criminal operations protected by judicial complicity in cover-up. The pattern of suppression is consistent across judicial, executive, and intelligence institutions that recognize certain evidence threatens their authority and exposes criminal activities conducted under official sanction. When authentic testimony surfaces documenting illegal government programs, constitutional violations, or institutional conspiracies, courts employ legal mechanisms including permanent sealing of records, national security classification that overrides public interest, and destruction orders that eliminate evidence proving systematic governmental criminality. The suppression extends beyond individual cases to reveal that judicial transparency functions as rhetorical commitment rather than operational reality. With classification authority, sovereign immunity doctrines, and sealed settlement agreements, creating legal frameworks that prevent accountability for crimes documented through sworn testimony and authenticated evidence presented in proceedings that were supposed to serve justice rather than conceal institutional misconduct. What emerges from these suppressed proceedings is evidence that courts themselves participate in cover-ups to protect government institutions from consequences of documented crimes. The cases prove that legal testimony describing plutonium injections into unwitting subjects, systematic denial of medical treatment, causing preventable deaths, destruction of evidence, proving assassination conspiracies, and planning for terrorist attacks on American citizens is systematically erased through mechanisms that courts themselves enforce. Classification overrides judicial transparency. Sovereign immunity eliminates remedies for constitutional violations, and sealed proceedings prevent public examination of evidence that documents decades of institutional criminality spanning radiation experiments that caused cancer, surveillance programs that violated constitutional rights, and covert operations that included drug trafficking and terrorist planning. The suppression represents not just judicial misconduct, but deliberate theft of evidence that belongs to the public. These court records document government radiation experiments on pregnant women and mentally disabled children, FBI operations that fabricated evidence and coordinated assassinations, CIA mind control programs that caused permanent brain damage, and military planning for false flag attacks designed to kill Americans. All brought before courts where evidence was examined and verified before being locked in classified archives, destroyed through official orders, or sealed under permanent court protections that prevent the very accountability that judicial proceedings supposedly guarantee. These legal records represent justice denied. Evidence of institutional crimes was brought before courts, examined by judges, and verified through legal proceedings, then deliberately hidden from citizens whose government operated criminal enterprises, protected by judicial mechanisms that transform courts into instruments of suppression rather than accountability. The suppression of these court cases represents not just legal censorship, but systematic erasure of evidence proving governmental institutions systematically violated constitutional protections, conducted criminal operations under official authority, and employed judicial processes to conceal rather than expose institutional criminality that shaped American history through radiation experiments, domestic surveillance, covert operations, and false flag planning that remain protected by classification, sealed records, and destruction orders that eliminate evidence of crimes documented in proceedings that were supposed to serve justice rather than protect criminals who operated under governmental authority. The judicial system preserves the most detailed documentation of controversial evidence, expert testimony, and classified information that challenges official government narratives. Court transcripts, sealed testimonies, and classified exhibits contain proof of illegal government programs, suppressed technologies, and institutional crimes that were brought before judges, but systematically buried through classification orders, permanent sealing of records, and destruction of evidence that would prove governmental criminality and constitutional violations. These 10 court cases represent documented legal proceedings where extraordinary evidence was presented under oath, authenticated by expert witnesses, and verified through judicial examination, then deliberately erased from public access through government intervention that employed legal mechanisms to transform courts into instruments of suppression rather than accountability. The pattern reveals that judicial transparency functions as rhetorical commitment rather than operational reality, with classification authority overriding constitutional protections, sovereign immunity eliminating remedies for documented crimes, and sealed proceedings preventing public awareness of evidence that threatens established power structures and institutional authority that depend on concealment of criminal activities conducted under official sanction.